the College of Arts, the University of Basra, is honored to host one of translation scholars in the Arab world, as well as translation theorist, a teacher, an author, Dr. Mahmoud al-Tarabin of the Islamic University in Gaza. Dr. Mahmoud has a PhD in translation and linguistics. He is currently an assistant professor at the Islamic University in Gaza. He has authored a number of publications that deal with media, discourse, with business, translation, and so many other fields. So today's lecture will be multifaceted, as the title suggests. He will focus on the translator's role. I think he will underline the new insights into the role that translators and interpreters may play. So, Dr. Mahmoud, we are happy to have you this evening, and you can start.
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm really honored to be with you, Dr. Jason, and your colleagues at the College of Arts, University of Basra. Inshallah, like our presentation today will be very focused with some practical examples on the translator's multifaceted role, ودور المترجم, متعدد, الأوجه. Of course, we can't really go directly into the topic without just seeing how do we really look at the concept of translation itself, because the concept of translation itself, or how we look at it, will shape our understanding of the role translators play in the translation process. Do we really think of translation as a mere replacement of textual materials between two languages? And if we take it that way, then translators normally play no role but replacing source language terms, sentences, or text with target language terms, sentences, and text. Do we look at it as domestication, bringing like the other to us? Do we look at it as foreignization? We take ourselves to the other, or do we consider meeting target language expectations when we think of like translation definitions and related topics? So it's important to really look at what do we mean by the concept of translation, or what does translation mean to us? Like if we actually look at the Arabic definition of the verb ترجمة, we find that it means فسر كلام فلان. So here, basically, they do not look at it as a kind of textual material, but rather an explanation of something into another language. It's also important that we look at the very basic term equivalence and translation. Although, I mean, having the word equivalence may seem to be a naive idea for overview, but it's really important that we look at it. Do we, because whatever you do in translation, there are only two basic things, regardless of what you want to name the translation process. We either have formal equivalence or dynamic equivalence. Regarding of whatever names are there, formal equivalence, I'm just focusing on the semantic equivalence between the source language and the target language. Dynamic equivalence, which may give me room to make few changes in the target text, for example, to meet a certain ideology, to meet target readers, for example, expectations. Equivalent effect, and this is actually something which is really difficult to achieve in translation, because equivalent effect has to do with time, has to do with person, has to do with social, cultural, and ideological constraints. So when we really say that I want to achieve an equivalent effect in my translation, this aim may seem far from being possible to achieve. So if this is the case with equivalence, then this should actually apply to the whole translation product we are presenting to our readers. Now, before going deep into the role of translators or the multifaceted role of translators, we need to see what are the factors which affect translators' roles. For example, we may have linguistic factors which are easy normally to deal with. These are just basic things which are easy to deal with. Do we talk about cultural factors? Now we are going to a higher level where things are not easy to be addressed or handled. Now, but if we basically look at linguistic factors, we may have a certain structure, we may have another word, things come. Sorry, I have to pause for a second.
Yes, Doctor, you can mute now.
Yeah.
You can mute now. So we will mute Dr. Mahmoud for less than 3 or 4 minutes until إقامة finishes.
Yeah, I think it was less than a minute, Dr. Jason.
Yes, go on, Doctor.
Yeah, so basically coming back to the topic, linguistic factors which affect translators' roles are somehow easier than dealing with cultural factors. But when things come to culture, they are actually linked to paratextual like factors, like could be mainly ideology, it could be religion, it could be society, it could be also other things which are not easy to deal with. Also, another aspect which like significantly influences the translator's role is what we have to take into consideration as the Scopus theory, which focuses on the purposeful action that determines translation strategy. Now, if we take this into consideration, we really cannot talk about loyalty to the source text at all. Now, I understand that a lot of people in the Arab world argue for being loyal to the source text, but this may not be like possible in all contexts. Now, if I have, for example, a text, an English text, which goes completely against my ideology, and I want to render this text to the target readers like following the same ideology as I do, or who believe in things in which I also believe, then in this way, the translator has to intervene or have to intervene so that my translation at the end has to be read by someone. So if my audience will not like my translation, then I'm not going to translate for myself. I can just read it into English. So Scopus theory, actually, if one looks into it, will focus on the purposeful action. It will also focus on the commission. If people are paid, or if translators are paid to carry out, or to conduct a translation process in a certain way, then we cannot tell them, no, you have to be loyal to the source text and you cannot make changes. These things are not at all possible if we take commission and translation, if we take cultural as well as ideological reasons into consideration. Now, every translation must have a specific purpose. Are you going just to inform the general readers about something? Are you going to draw their attention to a specific point you want to highlight? Are you, for example, going to change an ideology or change the way people think about something? You can also do that in your translation. In addition, also as rewriting. Now we come to this, especially in the context of Palestine, or in the context of the Palestinian-Israeli context. We strongly believe, like us here, that translation is a kind of rewriting and resistance. But how can I think of translation as rewriting? So if we, for example, look at this, the conventions which control the writing of a source text are said to meet expectations for the source author and readers. Now, every text, in whatever language it is written, it is meant to meet a specific purpose for the author in the first place and for the readers in the second place. Now, when we come to translating this text, which has a specific purpose for the author and also a specific purposes for the readers themselves, and when we come to think of that text being translated into another language, sometimes maybe these purposes are not the same, they are not identical, especially if we look at English and Arabic. It could be like very close between European languages, but certainly not between English and Arabic, unless the text is of very general purpose. Unless the text is of very general purpose, then we really can't think of the same expectations. Now, Lefebvre was actually the first one to speak about rewriting translation, says translation is a rewriting of the original text. Now, all translations, which are thought to be rewritings, reflect certain ideology. Now, this ideology changes in the process of translation from source text ideology or source text embedded ideology into target text ideology or target text embedded ideology. We go further, certain rewritings are inspired by motivations and are produced under ideological constraints, regardless of the rewriter's agreement on the dominant ideologies. Now, what we mean by that, if we take the, let me say, a news article in an Israeli English newspaper like Times of Israel. Now, sometimes they say, or they use expressions like Palestinian terrorist. Now we come to this, if a Palestinian newspaper is going to translate this, they will change it into Muqawimun Philistini. And here, this is an ideological constraint, which tells me as a translator that, look, Mahmoud, you have target readers whose ideology is completely different from the ideology of the source text. And this necessitates your interference in the text to change whatever has been said, or the descriptions, or the labeling in the source text to other labelings or descriptions which should meet the expectations of your target readers. If we also go further, Lefebvre uses the term patronage, and uses the term patronage, which refers to the powers. The powers may refer to person or institutions that can further or hinder the reading, writing, and rewriting of literature. We may also actually think of translation as a kind of literature. Now, when considering the Palestinian case in relation to translation as an act of resistance, we can notice that translation is mainly based on rendering mainly different types of Palestinian or pro-Palestinian genres. Now, what I mean by that is that there are Palestinians who write poetry, who write novels which reflect Palestinian resistance against the Israeli occupation. There are also other pro-Palestinian writers like Joe Sacco, from whose work I'll be presenting some examples. They write texts in support of the Palestinians. Also, these texts are literary genres. They could be comics, they could be, for example, novels, could also be poetry or other types of literary genres. Now, in our case, translators in conflict zones is an area where translators' roles normally change from somebody who's replacing textual material, source text material, text, writing, speech, whatever it is, into somehow different version in the target language. Now, in general, there is little literature on translators' roles in conflict and war zones, as, for example, Baker 2010 explains. Conflict generally refers to clash of interests or a situation in which two or more parties seek to undermine each other. So this is actually what is happening in translating, for example, English news, which contradict the Palestinian ideology or generally the Arab ideology to the Arab readers. It tries to undermine the role of the source text, for example, author and writer. Also, translators in conflict zones, they do not only replace text, but what they do is that they participate in circulating domestic public narratives beyond their national boundaries. So here, their role is not merely replacement of textual materials, but they participate in circulating domestic public narratives. Sometimes they actually re-narrate the whole writing of the source text in order that such writing or new writing meets the expectations of the target readerships, be they Palestinians or Arabs. Also, Baker explains that translators reframe aspects of political conflicts. So, in addition to their traditional role of replacing textual materials, they also reframe aspects of political conflicts and hence participate in the construction of social and political reality. Hermans also said that the translator's voice is always present in translation, and this voice is seen as a second voice, overtly seen in the translated text, which, all of these points reflect that translators intervene in the text, especially in the context of conflict, especially when there are conflicting ideologies. Translators cannot, in most cases, be loyal to the source text. They are in a condition where they are obliged to make specific changes so that these changes or the newly produced translation text would meet the expectations of the target reader. Now, when coming to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, we could just see examples how words are used in Israeli media and how are they used in Palestinian media, for example. Dr. Jassim, can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Mahmoud.
Yes, I'm sorry. I thought, yes. So
we are listening. Yes.
Yeah. So if you look at the term security fence, this is used in the Israeli media to refer to what the Arabs say who جدار الفصل العنصري, or what we call in English apartheid wall. So basically, security fence is used by Israeli, and this actually has an ideology in itself that, okay, we are building this fence only to protect ourselves from Palestinians, or what they call Palestinian terrorism. And as opposed to what we use in our newspapers, جدار الفصل العنصري, what we use in our newspapers is what we call جدار الفصل العنصري or apartheid wall. They also use in Israeli or Western media the word terrorist as opposed to freedom fighter, or they can call it مقاوم or استشهادي or something of a sort. They also use disputed territories as opposed to occupied territories. Now, there is a significant difference between the two in terms of their ideological, for example, expectations, their ideological meanings. They also use, for example, a Palestinian was killed, while in our news writing we say استشهد فلسطيني. They also use suicide bomber. We use istishhadi. We use istishhadi to refer to this. Now, I have few examples from Joe Sacker's footnotes into Gaza. This was actually an article by Balkozar, Tubati, and Hamim Abu Dayya from Jordan. They wrote, or they worked actually on a translation by Joe Sacco, and they highlighted the translator's interference, the translator actually clear interference in the text. Now, the first thing one can look at is the cover of the source novel and the target novel. Now, if you look at the left, or actually if you look on the left, you see the author, source text author name is written in capital. Like if we look at the Arabic translation, it's written in a smaller font, the last thing in the text. Now, if you also look at footnotes into Gaza, we see the word Gaza at the top. It's written with the biggest font. Also, Tarikh min al-Nidal. Now, these words, Tarikh min al-Nidal, are completely missing in the source text, are completely missing, but the translator had to add these to reflect the Palestinian struggle against the Israeli occupation. So actually, if you look at this, it tells you a lot about the translator role in this, re-narrating the whole work right from the title itself, or right from the cover itself. These actually, the words footnotes refer to two massacres, one in Khan city, the city like directly after my city, and the other one was in my own city. And they used footnotes, or Joseph used footnotes, because in his description of the work, he said they barely rated these two massacres in two Palestinian cities here in Gaza Strip. They barely rated a footnote in history. And that's why actually he used the word footnotes in the title. We go ahead also, we look at the translation of Palestine versus Israel. Now the source text, اللي هو الرواية الإنجليزية تبع جو ساكو, when translating place names on maps, it was Israel mentioned in the short one. The translator uses Palestine instead of Israel. So the source text will have Israel, the target text will have Palestine. Here, when we translate place names. However, the translator kept the names of the checkpoints as are. المعابر اللي بين قطاع غزة والأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة. He just kept the names as they are. Now, we look at these actually very practical examples from the translation itself. The IDF, or what we call Israeli Defense Force, or what is actually called Israeli Defense Force, is translated into Israel Army or Occupation Army. Normally, هم حيترجموها جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي or جيش الاحتلال الصهيوني in certain instances. If we also look at the addition here in the middle, in the target text, the word As-Sahayna was used, which cannot actually be there in the source text, which cannot be there in the source text. We also look at the word actions here, Israeli actions against Palestinians. Actions was translated as intihakat. Also, if we look at Israeli soldiers started shooting us, all of us. Here also they added the word يقتلنا, where the target text, for example, may imply that, but it doesn't say that directly. So here also like another example of the translator rewriting of the text. You want to call it resistance, you want to call it activism, whatever you want to call it, it's just a kind of rewriting the source language text into the target language so that it meets the expectations of the target readers. Militants, when it was used in the original text in Josako's work, it is translated in the Arabic translation as مناضل أو مناضلون أو مقاتل أو مقاتلون. Militancy as نضال, militant organization, for example, as منظمات نضالية, militant activities as أنشطة نضالية. If we also look at other examples which are common in English and Arabic translations, in the context of conflict, we find words like died, death, and killed. احنا بنستخدم استشهد أو استشهاد. We realized it was him. وأدركنا أنه استشهد. We realized that it was him. وأدركنا أنه استشهد. This is another example of also translators interference in the text. This, example is from Netanyahu's speech in the UN General Assembly in 2014. And this speech, اللي هو خطاب نتنياهو في الأمم المتحدة أو في الجمعية العامة المتحدة في عام 2014, has the highest words against, for example, Islam, Muslims, Iran, ISIS, and others of the source, only 2014 speech. So if you look here, for example, and it is rapidly spreading in every part of the world. So the Israeli translator, الترجمة هاي كانت موجودة حتى على هو موقع وزارة الخارجية الإسرائيلية. الترجمة العربية هذه موجودة على موقع وزارة الخارجية الإسرائيلية. فالمترجم الإسرائيلي أضاف التشدد الإسلامي، which wasn't actually there in the in the source text. The second example, and by this we conclude, trigger the apocalyptic return of an imam from the 9th century. So here you noticed, for example, that the translator added the word ash-Shi'i into the target text. This is also another intervention of the translation. You may call it, for example, rewriting. You may call it re-narrating. You may call it, for example, let me say, resistance. Whatever you call it, it's just a kind of translators' interference in the process of translation, mainly to meet the expectations of the target readers. And by this, I come to the conclusion of my very short talk. I hope it was somehow fruitful and beneficial. Dr. Jassim.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud, for sharing your ideas about the role of the translators. And I think our students, our guests, will comment and will seize the opportunity to ask you about some of these. We apologize for our audience for the noise that is in your, let's say, voice because of the, let's say, large maybe area that you are sitting in.
Yeah.
But we've got
but I hope the voice is clear.
Most of the
I hope
ideas.
it's clear, just to be.
Okay, Dr. Mahmoud, thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
Can I start by asking you if you go back just to the cover of the novel?
Sure. Yeah.
There is a kind of reframing, let's say, or re-narrating of the novel, which starts right from the cover.
Yes.
By let's say from paralanguage, let's say. Here, the source text is the Arabic or the English one?
English. It was the English one.
It was English. So,
yeah.
Do these changes reflect certain, let's say, cultural or ideological motivations, beliefs, and so on?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, do you have something to say, or shall I comment?
Okay. So, as far as
do you want to complete or
the whole title, the reframing of the title, of the colors, of the fonts, of let's say even the use of lowercase, higher case letters, do these reflect certain ideologies that you can interpret and relate to certain, let's say, sources or ideological sources? Can you find justifications? Have you thought of that?
Yes, I strongly believe that the translator intervention, or let me call it actually ideological intervention, in reframing the cover is very clear in this example. Now, if you look, number one, Gaza was mentioned at the end. Here it is at the beginning. If you also mention like footnotes in Gaza, and the original one, it was in bold, and it was really in a very big size, but it was here in a smaller font also. The author, or the name of the author himself, it was right at the beginning, here it was at the end. And for example, here, preference or importance first goes to the author, then here to the text. But here, for example, it's mentioned after that, which actually tells me that the translator focuses more on Gaza, what is happening in Gaza, rather than mentioning the author's name at the beginning. Another example of the ideologically manipulated intervention of the translator is the addition of Tarikh min al-Nidal, which wasn't at all mentioned in the title. The use of the word Tarikh is extremely important in the Palestinian context, whether for Palestinians or even for Israelis, because both say that it is, for us, it's history. For us, it's history. Even for the Israelis, they believe it's history. Although this word wasn't mentioned in the source text or in the cover of the source text, it is highlighted in the cover of the of the Arabic translation. Also, the word nidal, which actually, now Josako, when he wrote this word, he was sympathizing with the Palestinian, but he did not interfere to the level and say that it was like a struggle. He talked about it as a kind of hardships where Palestinians experienced. But the word nidal also tells the reader that, look, whatever Palestinians are doing, whatever they are facing is, a type of resistance against the Israeli, let me say, occupation. So in many ways, the translator ideological can be clearly seen in the title, or at least that's what I believe.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud.
You're welcome.
Most of our audience, are students.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your advice for them when they are asked to translate? Do you want to draw their attention to certain aspects that they are unaware of, starting from the cover, for example, from notes, footnotes, styles of writing, the use of images, the use of colors? Sometimes when they translate, they don't pay attention to such minute details.
Yeah.
So what is your advice, first of all, as a translation critic, let's say, and then as a teacher?
Yeah. Well, actually, Dr. Jassim, this question summarizes the whole work of translation. And if we want to simply put it into two different things, first of all, whatever a translator is going to do is not governed by the translator himself. I believe, or I strongly believe, that the room or the freedom the translator enjoys is extremely limited. Why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because, for example, you have a certain ideology of supporting your own, for example, people, and you want to make certain changes, as these changes and as well as the changes we've just seen in translating terrorists as for example, the power. But still, this translation is governed by the people who are going to publish this translation for you. Okay, we may all agree that if the word terrorist in the source text is mentioned, then I, as an Arab translator, need to make it as, for example, nashad. But still, I'm not the one who says or who has the complete say of this. There is a publisher for this. It could be a publishing house, it could be a newspaper, it could be anything else. They will tell you, for example, look, our ideology is against the source text ideology. So the translator has to make changes to meet their ideological expectations. Or look, our ideology is in line with the source text. So here the translator cannot actually make any changes which he or she feels are necessary. The reason is that if they make any changes, then the one who's going to publish their translations will say, look, your translations are against my ideology and I cannot accept it. So I strongly believe that the one who has the final say on what translators exactly should do are not translators themselves, because at the end, it is either the readers or those who will publish the translators. So, for example, if we want to look at something which is of, let me say, loaded, or which is loaded with ideological, let me say, terms, ideological expectations, I have to first look at who's going to read my translation. Is it, for example, the Arabs? So, okay, for the Arabs, I know that they are supporting the Palestinians, they are supporting also others, حتى لو كان النصوص مثلا على العراق, and there are English texts which go against the ideologies of the Iraqis. Who's going to read my publication or my translation? Is it the Iraqis, for example, or the Palestinians? If so, then I can make changes. But what if now, let me give you two very clear examples. If we look at the word terrorist, if we look at Al Jazeera and Al Arabiyya, for example, Al Jazeera will say, مقاوم فلسطيني, whereas Al Arabiyya will say إرهابي فلسطيني. I, as a translator, have to see who's going to publish my translation. If it is Al Jazeera, then I choose, for example, Muqawam. If it is Al Arabiyya, then I say, no, although I don't believe in describing the Palestinian as Irhabi, I have to do it as Irhabi because Al Arabiyya wants to publish my translation. So at the end, the end point of the lesson is that we really have to see who's our publisher, we have to see who's our audience, because they are the ones who judge, who are going to accept or to reject our translation. I hope I answered your question. So again, relatively answered your question.
No, thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. Dear audience, if you have any question, you can write it in the chat box, or you can raise your hands. Dr. Mahmoud, meanwhile, you've talked about translators in the war zones, particularly now Palestine, let's say. Do you face, let's say, dilemmas, detention, let's say, threat, as far as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is concerned? If you are a translator and it translates something that is ideologically, let's say, motivated and so on.
Yeah, I just have to mention that now what is remaining from Palestine is divided into two parts. The Gaza Strip, where I live, and the West Bank, which is the other part. Now, the Israelis have more control on the West Bank, where, for example, they can easily detain any Palestinian when they want to travel to Jordan or when they want to move from one city to the other. But for me, for example, here we are somehow at liberty to translate in the way we want. Where is the difficulty? The difficulty is, for example, if I translate something which really bothers the Israeli, let me say, intelligence or the Israeli politicians, and I want to cross to the West Bank, there is a checkpoint between Gaza and the West Bank, which is also controlled by the Israelis. So if there is something which I wrote and they didn't like, one may get actually detained on this checkpoint. But here in Gaza, we are somehow at liberty of translating the way our target readers, expect our translation to be. But yes, some people can be detained for this, especially in the West Bank, not in Gaza. I mean, I haven't heard of any case, Dr. Jassim, but maybe it can happen.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. Bayda, do you have a question? Bayda? Okay, Khansa.
Yes.
Yes. You
Good
can
evening.
ask. Good evening. You can ask Dr. Mahmoud.
Yes, thank you, sir. First of all, thank you for this actually interesting lecture. My question is for you, sir. So what do you think of the idea, can the translator be more creative than the author? Because I see the expression Gaza تاريخ من النضال actually, in my opinion, is more stronger than footnotes in Gaza. So, and as you know, Ajah has said, the translator text will be always in secondary level than the original one. So what do you think of can be the translator?
Yes, go ahead. I mean, Sister Khansa, I think you meant like, can the translator be more creative or something like that?
Yes.
Yes, I strongly believe that in this case, the translator can be, I mean, in a way, more creative in presenting or in completely re-narrating the source text to meet the expectations of the target readers. And in this context, the translator may add, may delete, may change certain words, which, for example, the translator himself and the publisher see are necessary or deem as necessary so that the translation can be read. And yes, the translator in this has to be innovative because his or her innovation has to draw the attention of the target readers who are either Palestinian or Arabs in general in this context.
Oh,
Thank
yes.
you, Dr. Muhammad. Thank you. Do you have another question, Khansa?
Excuse me?
Do you have another question or that's all?
It's no, it was very clear lecture. Thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot. Bayda.
Yes, good evening, Dr. Jassim.
Good evening.
Good evening for everyone. Sorry, Doctor, I guess you called my name, but this is a poor connection, actually.
Oh, no problem, no problem.
No problem.
Okay, my question is for Dr. Mahmoud. At the beginning, hi, Dr. Mahmoud.
Hello.
Glad to have this opportunity.
It's my honor.
Thank you, Doctor. My question, I didn't know if Dr. Jassim come across such a question because of poor voice, actually. But my question is about the cover of the book. I didn't know if you are make some addition on the title because I didn't find غزة تاريخ من النضال in the source one. So I wonder if you add some word from your own, Doctor.
No, actually, as I highlighted, the whole novel was translated by Jemíع, who's, I believe, a Palestinian living in Syria. So the work isn't actually mine, but I'm just commenting on it, showing the interference of the translator or the re-narrating of the translator. And if you can see, for example, Tariq من النضال is an addition which wasn't there at all. Mainly the addition, the manipulations of the translator interference in the text could be through addition, could be through deletion or omission, it could be through reordering or organization of the text. Yes, here, for example, a great example is addition, which wasn't at all in the source text. And this addition serves ideological purposes for the translator, for the publisher, and for the Arab readers. If the publisher didn't like that, it will not be here. And if it is expected that the Arab readers will not like that, it will not also be here.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. I think Bayda wants you to suggest, what is your suggestion as a translator? Will you opt for the translation, or you may add your own as a Palestinian who is living in Gaza?
Is she still there? Maybe she's.
Yes, I think Dr. Mahmoud, I think she also wanted your let's say, suggested changes, can you, let's say, modify the title you yourself or underline aspects that we are unaware of? Because you are there in the conflict zone. You share, maybe you share the author's ideology or the translator's ideology.
Well, in my case, as I said earlier, Dr. Jason, regardless of the fact I share the ideology of the translator, at the end, what is presented to the target readers, I'm not the one who completely decides on this. Even if I like it to be translated in a way, and the publisher doesn't want it to be in this way, at the end, there is a kind of compromise. There is a room, for example, for addition and deletion. Now, as I mentioned earlier, for my answer to Sister Khansa, if the publisher, this is, for example, for me, Tarikh Min al-Nidal is a very important and actually innovative addition to the title. But at the end, the translator, him or herself, is not the one who completely decides on this. Maybe I will add it, but when the reviewers and when the publisher sees this, they will say, look, this could cause us some trouble. It has to be deleted. At the end, the translator has to really think of, for example, the commission, the publisher, and the target readers. Although, for example, sometimes the translator may have opposing ideas than those of the publisher and the readers, but if the translator doesn't actually do what they ask for, then they will not accept his translation. They will see somebody else who conducts his translation, which goes in line with their ideological expectations.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. Dr. Mahmoud, what about business translation? Do you think that the role of the translator is just technical? It is ideologically free, let's say, intervention, or there may be certain interventions that change the text, though the texts are technical, let's say?
Well, I think the types of text where the translator role is clear and which can actually be easily noticed has to do either with, for example, society, with religion, and with politics. But if we have technical text, or for example, business text, the translator actually has, the intervention of the translator is valueless. I mean, why would they need, for example, to change a business term from the source text to target text? So here in technical text, in general, the translator role is less visible than their role, for example, in basically political text, media text, literary text, for example. Here there's more room for translator intervention. But for example, technical text, I personally do not see any need for the translator intervention, except for making some, let me say, lexical or syntactic changes so that they go, or they meet the, they meet the structure of the target language.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. Dr. Mahmoud, which one is, let's say, hospitable, welcomes, let's say, intervention, media texts or literary texts, as far as translation in the conflict zones is concerned?
Yeah, I strongly believe that the intervention in media text is more visible than the intervention in literary text. Because in media, normally they use very clear ideologically loaded terms. And here, if the terms are really very clear, this means the translator intervention can also be very clear. There could be intervention in the literary text, but it may not be as visible as the media text. So we can say that media text come first in terms of translator intervention.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. If you have any other question, we have bothered Dr. Mahmoud with
No, not at all. It's my pleasure.
With so many questions, but we want to the opportunity.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure.
Okay. because you live there, you sense the air of, let's say, of the conflict with the Israelis, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you will actually find it strange. Last May, I mean, to be very honest, in this same place where I'm sitting now, there was a war in Gaza and missiles were like targeted everywhere. I was, I mean, about to complete my second book with Routledge on business translation. And I was sitting in this very place and hearing the bombardment here and there. So sometimes, I mean, this is just a routine. Now things are somehow calm, but you never know when it will get worse.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. It's our great pleasure to have you this evening.
The pleasure is all mine, Dr. Jason. The pleasure is all mine.
We are so grateful, and we are looking forward to host you in future occasions. So thank you very much for your time, for your effort, and we are really delighted to have you this evening. Thank you so much.
The pleasure is all mine, Dr. Jason. I'm also really very thankful for you for having me to speak to you, students and colleagues as well. The pleasure is all mine. And I really hope that we can see one another in another meeting, another new topic sometime soon in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. Thanks.
You're most welcome. You're most welcome.
Thanks.
Assalamu alaikum.
عليكم السلام دكتور ورحمة الله وبركاته.